What's the darkest secret you found out about a family member/relative? When I was a kid, we went to my grandma's house every Sunday and all of my uncles and aunts would be there. One day I noticed that one of my uncles didn't show up anymore, so I asked my family where he is. They told me that he wouldn't be able to visit anymore because he moved away. Years later I found out that he raped and killed 2 women and they locked him up. Stepfather was cheating on mother. Didn't find out because he was caught cheating. Found out because he and his mistress were drunk. Got in a fight. And he punched her so hard that she fell over and died. Found out about the whole thing during the investigation, the trial, and the conviction. Was weird to have a lawyer want to call 2-year-old me to a stand to defend the character of man I already had very little interaction and a fear of, and that was before the manslaughter charge. My father tried to kill my mother while she was pregnant with me. 2 years ago I found out that my dad had a wife before my mom, and she died in a freak accident on their wedding night. Edited, she was sleepwalking and fell to her death over the balcony, if anyone was wondering. A few years before he passed, my dad and I had a long heart-to-heart, at the end of which, he told me he wasn't the one to first sleep with my mom on their honeymoon. He caught her in bed with her cousin, with which she had been in love for a long time. He spoke with their pastor, who told him to forgive and forget. That worked, until 6 years later, when he caught her again, with the same cousin. He told me he wanted to leave with me, but ultimately decided to stay, because he wanted me to have a family. With all that happened in my childhood, and to him, workaholic, diabetes, heart attack, I wish he'd left and be happy instead. I found out that my grandfather's first wife, before my grandma, died of botulism from eating some tomatoes she had canned at home. She could have been saved, but he refused to take her to the doctor because the botulism was her fault. He let her die to teach her a lesson. Edit, they had 2 kids he left motherless. Guessing she didn't have a choice in whether or not to be the one responsible for canning her own food, either. My great uncle is a rapist that prefers underage family members. I don't know how many people actually know, but my grandparents certainly do, along with his victims, my mom, aunt, and I know at least a few or their cousins, but I'm not sure which. But then he found Jesus again, so we all have to forgive him and pretend nothing happened. It was before I was born, but that's the basic runaround I've gotten from my grandparents. They don't ever actually acknowledge it, just that Tony did bad things, but he found God. I eventually put 2 and 2 together about my mum's history or sexual assault and her making sure that me and my female cousins were never left alone with him. And now that I'm in my 20s, that duty has been passed down to me at every family gathering. It's like an unspoken rule that you can't say why. Just the warning. Don't leave your daughters alone with him. I'm tired of it though. Tired of shooing little girls away and having to pretend like it's normal. Scoping toddlers out of a predator's arms and acting like everything's fine and I'm just baby crazy. When this is all over, I'm not going to stay quiet anymore. The next time I have to around him, I'm taking children right back to their parents with the full effing story of why it's dangerous. I'm tired of having to protect a rapist to keep peace. There is strong debate in our family as to whether my aunt fell out of the window of her flat, whether she jumped or was pushed. She survived, but with brain damage, and says she can't remember. Not really dark at all, but surprising. My mild-mannered Buddhist lawyer uncle was International Mr. Leather's Leather Daddy's Boy of the Year sometime in the late 80s. I found out from my dad that one of my cousins isn't related to anyone in the family. My aunt and her mother used to work at a hospital maternity ward, and apparently a woman came in one day and gave birth to him and then left the next day without him. My aunt decided to adopt him, but a few months later the woman showed up again asking where he was. They both lied that he was given up and didn't have a clue where he was. They still haven't told my cousin anything. My dad told me that before my mom and dad broke up, he hadn't been happy with her for several years. My mother even had a miscarriage at one point, which destroyed the both of them. But he couldn't leave her because he was afraid that she would hurt or even kill herself. so his only thought was to have a kid with her, so that motherly instinct would hopefully prevent her from killing herself. Are you the child that resulted? What a burden to have to carry. My uncle tells the story that when he was a kid, his older brother wanted him to go out hunting with him in the woods near their house. They woke up really early and started walking much deeper into the woods than they usually did, and way off the normal trails they used. My uncle realized his brother was letting him get further and further ahead. He stopped and turned around to see his brother starting to bring the shotgun up in his direction. He asked him what the hell was he doing. His brother said, "Oh, I thought I saw something." My uncle decided to go back at that point. Later that week he went back and found a pit that someone had dug a bit further off the trail. He never went anywhere with his brother alone again. Edit. Holy shit. Did not expect to see all these responses when I got off from work. Okay. To answer some of the questions, both of them are mom's brothers. The one, Abe Kane, was a narcissist of the not letting a silly thing like being married get in the way of his dating life variety, who decided he had big dreams and bailed on the family and his wife when I was a kid and proceeded to odd. Thus I usually don't think of him as my uncle because I didn't have a real relationship with him. Not sure why he didn't shoot my uncle, might have wanted it to look more like an accident, or didn't want to look his brother in the eye. For those saying it's just a story, yeah, I can't prove it, since there were only 2 people there, and one of them is dead now, of the aforementioned odd. But the way that my uncle described it, he was really afraid of his brother and thought he was capable of fratricide. I found out my father raped my sister when I was 11 years old. She was only 7 when he was sexually abusing her. My uncle didn't have an aneurysm stroke spontaneously. Sorry, I'm not a doctor. He deliberately stopped taking his blood thinners. Dude was 63 with a wife, 4 kids and 15 grandkids. The oldest of which was 13 and the youngest was not even a year. He was just done. His wife doesn't know. His kids don't know. I only know cause I overheard the family doctor telling my dad. As far as I know, only myself, the doctor, and my dad know. I found out that my great-grandpa got away with murder. He thought that my great-grandma was cheating on him with her dentist, so he went into his office and shot him. He got away with it too, and they didn't find out that he did it until he told everybody before he died. Edit. Since a lot of people are asking if she actually cheated on him, I don't know. But considering he was an asshole, that she was afraid to leave, and he ended up being capable of murder, probably. My biological grandfather threatened to kill my grandmother while she was very young and pregnant with my uncle. Long story short, he was engaged to someone else. My grandmother became a nervous wreck while pregnant and wouldn't leave the house, and he used to throw bricks through the window. Eventually she told some of her friends about what he'd threatened to do to her. Shortly after that he went missing, never to be seen or heard from again. We always kind of laughed and joked that one of her friends must have threatened him or ran him out of town. We would even go as far to say someone might have killed him for her. It wasn't until we were going through her boxes of photos and love letters we realized she was actually friends with the Cray twins. I think you have your answer, mate. One of my aunts raised another aunt's baby as her own. My mom had 4 sisters and a brother, all of whom got married and had kids. So I have around 20 cousins. Unfortunately 3 of my aunts got breast cancer in their 30s. All 3 recovered, but years later the youngest, Mariah, got it again and got it worse. Mariah needed a bone marrow transplant. All her sisters and children got tested, but no one matched. The family then revealed that Mariah had had a teenage pregnancy. Her first child was actually my cousin John, who had been adopted and raised by my oldest aunt as her second child. None of the cousins knew about this, including John and his revealed to be adoptive siblings. John was asked to get tested and was a match, so he agreed to donate bone marrow to his birth mom, Mariah. John was in his late 20s at the time and had had very little contact with Mariah over his life, so he's pretty cool. The transplant took, but Mariah eventually succumbed a year or so later. Edit. My family is very aware of the risks of breast cancer affecting any of us. Luckily none of my female or male cousins have gotten it. We are all still vigilant and self-check ourselves regularly. I found out 2 years ago that my mother had a baby she gave up for adoption 18 months before she had me, and then had another baby when I was 3, and she also gave that baby up for adoption. All 3 of us have different fathers, and I think the only reason she kept me was because my father married her, but that marriage only lasted a year. My mother remarried when I was 5 and my half brother was born when I was 7. As far as I knew, for 59 years he and I were our mother's only children. I never saw her pregnant with the second baby because she sent me to live with my great-grandparents across the country during her pregnancy. My mother and grandmother were the only people who knew about this, and they both took the secret to their graves. The only reason any of it was found out is because of all of the DNA testing people now do. This discovery really impacted my sense of identity for a while, my view of my mother, and our relationship. I've met my half-siblings, an older sister and younger brother. I like them, and I'm glad I've been able to answer some of their questions, but the initial discovery really messed with me for a bit. My mom and dad decided to take in my 3 cousins because their mom got into a horrible car accident. 2 girls and 1 boy. The girls were 6 and 10, the boy 12. Fast forward to when the 6-year-old girl is 14 years old and is asked about birth control. She starts sobbing, saying her brother, then 12 years old, took her virginity when she was 6, and that it continued until she was about 13. We had no clue. A great uncle went to prison for statutory rape. It only takes a few minutes around him to know he's disgusting. Both of my mother's parents had affairs without the other's knowledge. My grandmother had Parkinson's, and in one of her confused states she told my grandfather that she had an affair. Suffice to say, my grandfather was not happy and put her in a home. He then started talking to my mother, trying to figure out when it could have happened. He speculated that it happened around the same time he was having his affair, which was around 1966. My mother was shocked. She was born in 1967. So my mother may or may not be related to the man she believed to be her father. Edit. Phrasing. I recently found out that my grandmother committed suicide as a result of the sexual abuse she received from her grandfather as a child, aged 8 to 14. Apparently her mother and many of her relatives were compliant with it and would even send her to his house for week-long visits where she would sleep in his bed. My step-grandfather had a completely hidden life in Australia before he met my grandmother. He had a family and kids in Australia and faked his death by driving his car off a cliff, then moving to America. His kids thought he was dead until my grandmother found out about them and reached out years later. His son actually became a famous comedian over there, and from what I know, has a joke he does at his shows about his father faking his death to disconnect from them. Edit. Yes, it's Greg Fleet. A relative tried to poison one of their guests. Once I learned about it, it finally sealed the deal for me and forever changed my view on them. They were bonkers anyway, but good lord, that's too much. My grandfather, who I never met, was in a cult, and him and his friends sexually abused my father and uncles. The weird thing is, my father gave me his first name for my middle name. I've always thought it was the Stockholm Syndrome that made my father name me after his pervert and demented dad. I'm legally changing my name on my next birthday. My father has never been a normal person. Supposedly, according to my uncle, he got the worst of the abuse, which I accredit to his messed up childhood. My uncle's family claimed he had polio instead of a hereditary crippling disease. His wife figured it out when she went to their family reunion. She already had 1 child and was pregnant with another. My grandpa, who died back in 2017, was a very quiet man and didn't talk a lot. A few years before he died, my mom, his daughter, told me why. Apparently when he was around 10 years old back in the late 30s or early 40s, a girl around his age lived across the street. One time they went out with his rifle to shoot at random things in the woods. On their way home there was a fence they had to get over to get home. My grandfather leaned his rifle on the fence to help his friend get over the fence, since she was a girl. As she was going over, the rifle fell over and went off, killing the girl. After the cops got involved, he was found to not be at fault. but the girl's family stood out in the street at various times over the next 2 weeks, yelling murderer at my grandpa's house. He eventually couldn't take it and ran away from home. In his teens he met this guy named Rocky and befriended him. Rocky was supposedly in his early to mid 20s. Something happened where Rocky ended up passing away and my grandfather took his name. I had always wondered why my grandfather had a different last name than his brothers. Here is where it gets even weirder. My dad was adopted and until recently, we didn't know anything about his biological family. Well, thanks to all of the DNA tests that have become common, we ended getting connected with his biological family, to include his dad, my dad's dad, who is still alive and in his late 80s. Talking to that part of the family, we have come to find out that my dad's biological dad has almost the same story as my mom's dad. He also had accidentally killed someone as a child, ran away from home, and changed his identity. Can you do a TLDR in the comments? My mom's dad accidentally killed girl, ran away from home, and changed his identity. My dad is adopted. We found his bio dad, and he has almost the exact same story. Killed someone as a child, ran away from home, and changed his identity. My parents told us they were married in secret until they found out my mom was expecting, and then they told their families. It later came to light that they married on the day they found out my mom was pregnant and lied to their parents and us, but that wasn't the doozy. My father was an only child and his parents absolutely idolized him. They were very strict Catholics and very strict with my dad, never allowing him to play sports because they feared losing him or whatnot. My paternal grandmother had like 5 miscarriages. Anyway, after my dad's parents passed, he was going through their documents and he learned they had to get married too. Their wedding license was dated 2 months after the date he had always been told. I know it's not a very dark secret, just a very Catholic secret in a very Catholic family. A cousin confided in me a month ago that she was molested by my grandfather when we were kids. She even told me that I was there with her when this was happening and I somehow don't remember anything about it. I hope he's burning in hell for it. My grandmother used to kidnap and sell young girls in Mexico back in the 50s and 60s. She would sell them to ranchers to presumably be wives and or sex slaves. She was not a good person at all. My dad has a brother who I've never met, and I didn't even know about his existence until a few years ago. I asked my parents why nobody from the family talks about him, and why haven't they invited him to us, but they said just because. And then we had other relatives over at our house, and I heard them talking about him, and it turns out the guy's a criminal, and he spent almost all his life in prison, but the worst thing he did is that he was molesting his own daughter, or at least he was accused with it, but my mother, and also the half of the extended family believes till this day, that his daughter just made it up for attention. Found out the hard way that my grandfather was a sexual predator. Turns out my grandmother had been in denial despite both my aunts, their friends, and young girls in their small town claiming he raped/molested them. One 16-year-old even got pregnant, and he paid for the abortion. Grandma lied about his whereabouts/activities for years to protect him, because if he went to jail she'd be unable to afford their house. So, long story short, me and my then 10-year-old cousin were his latest and final victims. Thanks, Grandma. My mother supposedly has a fraternal twin. My grandmother couldn't handle the thought of 2 kids, so she gave the male child away to someone she knew that was moving away. In a drug-induced rage one night my grandmother screamed at my mom that she kept the wrong child. It was never mentioned before or after that moment. My mom was roughly 12 at the time. She asked my great-grandmother about it, and she knew the boy's name, but not where they moved to, or who he was living with. My mom actually had met him once, but didn't know who he actually was. My grandmother denies it ever happened, and my grandfather felt that surely they'd have had to tell me. I doubt they would have though. When she was pregnant with me, my mom asked my great-grandmother what my middle name should be. My middle name is actually his middle name. Edit, fraternal twins, not paternal twins. This will probably get lost, but here's my story. Had some family moved to Vegas with the local church's money, close to $1 million, to open a new church for them in Sin City. They gambled it all away. Came back, church told them to F off basically. They started their own church that allowed them to buy multi-million-dollar houses, brand new cars for them and their kids. Basically a luxury lifestyle. They sell merch at the front door to the church. Members are required to provide bank info, and they tithe 10% monthly income from all families. If you don't pay up, they kick you out. They tell you how to eat and exercise. If you don't follow, they kick you out. They put it in an old movie theater, so they have multiple stages, full lighting and have crews. They do love offerings when they need extra cash. God tells them to take trips, like told their congregation God told them to ride motorcycles through the Grand Canyon. He even claimed he had healing powers for a short amount of time, and got Satan to toot down his arm. The whole 9 yards. At the beginning of the pandemic, when they were shutting everything down, they pressured their congregation to pay the 10% for the whole year up front. They've cut contact with all our family because we won't be part of their church. Also, their church is well known in our city and local area, but no one has stepped in. Cause, yeah, no. Bible Belt. My cousin started a cult. My parents had a nasty divorce which was often accompanied by a lot of shit talking about each other. There was a lot of, well, your mother blah 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 and your dad is such and such. Most of which I would just ignore because it was incredibly immature and embarrassing. Until one day my mom broke out the big guns. My siblings and I were just watching TV in the living room one day and the conversation moved to my dad coming to town to visit. At which point my mom overheard. The mere mention of dad prompted this woman to stop whatever she was doing, come into the living room, and say something along the lines of, talking about your dad again. Huh, did you know that he was molested? My dad had never mentioned anything about it in the 18 years that I lived with him, which is understandable. To this day, I have no idea why my mom felt the need to blurt that out to the three of us, or why it is she thought that being the victim of sexual abuse was a stain on someone's character. But it was a really weird way to find out something so deeply personal about my dad. TL. Doctor, my mom told my siblings and I that my dad was molested when he was little as a way to spite him. Edit. Just for clarification and to ease my conscience. My mom was actually a great mom. She practically raised us on her own. And the divorce wasn't her fault in the slightest. She got hit with the death of both of her parents and a divorce all within a 2-year time span. On top of losing the house. This was completely out of character for her, which is part of why it caught all of us off guard. She's a good woman that said something shitty that she now regrets. Judge as you will. But I had to clear the air after all of the "your mom is a cunt" comments. Found out my birth father was still alive and living in California after being told 4 years he had died in the Navy before I was born. Fast forward a couple of years and a sister whom I was told had died at birth contacted me saying she had been adopted. Put all the pieces together and found out that my grandparents, mother then 16 and uncle then 14, were stealing cars in Southern California and running them down to Tijuana. When the feds started snooping, the whole family ran for the border and made it as far as Central America, where my mother discovered she was pregnant with me. They then turned north and made it to Zapata, Texas, where I was born. She gave me the name of her last boyfriend and told me he died in the Navy. Less than a year after I was born, she gave birth to my half-sister and gave her up for adoption, telling the family she was stillborn. My mother was a pathological liar all her life and I didn't find out until I joined the Navy at 17 and found my birth father was still alive. Also found out my grandmother was a prostitute, madam, and arsonist as well, but that is another story. I'm the only child between my mom and dad, but they both had children from previous relationships. All of my siblings were 15 plus years older than me when I was 7. My mom and dad split because my dad had feelings for my mom's oldest daughter who already had 4 kids. Okay, gross and shitty, but both adults, so whatever. Cut to 13 years or so later, and my dad is suddenly all involved in the life of one of the kids of that sister. 20-year me was oblivious as to why this was happening. Took me another 7 years to put all the pieces together that my dad was the father of that kid. I had grown up thinking she was just niece, but she was in reality my half-sister niece. I've never discussed it with anyone in my family. My mom died before I put all the pieces together. But wait. There's more. My family and I are all from Mississippi. Cue Deliverance banjo music. My dad was born in 1945, so unsurprisingly, he's super racist. And I mean like, super racist. That sister niece of mine, she ended up having 2 kids with one-legged black man. The one-legged part isn't really relevant except for him showing up to my house one day and suddenly doing push-ups in my living room for no apparent reason. Anyway, karma's a bitch. Cheat on my mom with your stepdaughter. Get her knocked up. Basically have nothing to do with said child's life, then the child goes and commits, in his eyes, probably the biggest betrayal possible. I would throw a chef's kiss right here, except all I really care about from this story is the pain it must have put my mom through, and I was too young or oblivious to be there for her. Miss you, Cotty. Since a lot of these are about murders and rapists, mine is a bit funny. We once found a family photo album in my wacky aunt's house. Start flipping through the plastic pages and boom, gangbang photos. There had to be like 20 to 30 people in these photos. It was back in the 80s, I'd imagine, and everyone was so hairy and ugly. I guess Aunt Jan is part of a swinging community. Edit. Wow. Thank you everyone. This is the first time I've gotten a lot of love on here. It's a funny story only me and my brothers know. We've always considered our Aunt Jan to be very weird. But after seeing that album it all kinda made sense. Nice lady though.